Okay, ready, Auden? Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my great pleasure today to introduce our wonderful colleague, Auden Dahl, who did not come from California, but very luckily for us was great fortune. He's doing his sabbatical in Norway currently, and very kindly agreed to pay Oxford a visit to give his presentation today. So Auden is adamant that he's not a philosopher, but he started his degree in philosophy in Norway, and then went on to do his PhD at Berkeley. And I think we met for the first time over fish tacos in Seattle at a conference in 2013. And then 1 year later, Auden received his PhD and then moved on to become an assistant professor and an associate professor at University of Santa Cruz in wonderful California. And now somehow the East Coast has lured him over, and he's starting a new faculty position in Cornell starting next year. I will not take away any of your precious talking time. I just really like to say that we're very happy to be able to have you here, to host you here. Very much looking forward to your presentation. If it's okay for everyone, we'll have the question or toward the end, so we'll give all the time to give his presentation, and then I'll be here leading the discussion and question section afterwards. So thank you so much for coming on, and really a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you all for being here. I know this is after the academic year, almost, and also I'm in the middle of interview and admissions week, I understand, for some of you. So thank you for taking their time to show up here today and talk about, or hear and then talk about morality. I was asked to start to say a few words about my journey, and so that's convention here, and it seems like a sensible one. So if you're really uninterested in that, then just think about something else, check your phones for a moment, but I'm happy to say a little bit about that. I don't think that my path to where I am now is anything to be followed, because it's a weird, windy path, but I guess it just shows how windy paths can be sometimes, and they'll work out okay. So I'm from Norway. I grew up, this is a picture from my house where I grew up in the snowy fields of rural Norway. And for whatever reason, I got very interested in morality early on. I remember experiences of friends, two friends, stealing money from me at some point. And I just finding this very puzzling and just very upsetting, obviously. And I think those kinds of like moral puzzles stuck with me. Like both, why would they do this? Like why would somebody take money from somebody who was supposed to be a friend? But also, why not take money from a friend? When you think about it, you have the money, you can find other friends. So this question, like what makes it wrong to steal? And how can you convince somebody who doesn't think it's wrong to steal from a friend that it is wrong to steal from a friend? These kinds of questions, I think, preoccupy me for much, since I was quite young and still do. Initially, I thought these were philosophical questions. So I started in philosophy, as Robert said, about what is right and what is wrong. And eventually, I became, I still love philosophy and I have huge admiration for philosophers, but I guess I found that maybe I didn't have the patience or the right intellectual temperament for it, because I started wanting to have data today that I didn't have yesterday to see how something pointable that reminded me that I made some progress. Oh, beautiful. Except it's blinding some of you. Should I pull down these? It's going to be making a little messianic. Warrant or anything. Couldn't live up to that. Anyways, yeah, so I started, instead of asking why should we do this or what ought we to do, I started being more interested in how do we come to be so convinced that there are certain things we ought to do and certain things we ought not to do, and why we sometimes disagree about why we ought to do something or ought not to do something. So that took me from philosophy in Norway and some in France to then doing developmental psychology in California. And I was at Berkeley for 6 years. So that's the tower in Berkeley here, the Campanile. And then since 2014, I've been in Santa Cruz, and now I'm moving to the East Coast. So is that fitting with the tradition of intellectual journey, or intellectual, sounds too grandiose, journey anyways, bringing me here today. I'm very happy to be here. Just been, frankly, magical since I arrived, and I've Robert put me up in New College, and just what a beautiful place. I'm just filled with envy for all of you. If I can have both sabbatical and be in Oxford all the time, I would do that. But I won't bother you with my presence every day, but I'm really happy to be here today and tomorrow, and I look forward to speaking with many of you about these things and things that you're talking about and thinking about these days. Okay, so my talk today, I will root some branches of our right and wrong. 3 insights from my developmental and moral psychology is part of a bigger project I'm engaged in, I guess, over the past couple of years, including my sabbatical. Because over the past 20 years, there's just been an explosion of research, psychological research on morality that spanned virtually all sides or parts of psychology, from research on infants to research on adults, research on cognition, research on neuroscience, research on emotions, research on social relations. And this has been empirically, I think it's just been an enormous success. Just the amount of things we know today that we didn't know 20 years ago is staggering. At the same time, if we try to put all this data together from kids, from infants, from adolescents, from adults, it gives us a very disjointed picture of what human morality looks like across the lifespan. If we imagine some Martin coming down here, jumping on one of those shuttles that go out there, and trying to make sense of human morality based on psychological research, I think they would come away very confused if they just took that body of research. They would come away thinking, for instance, that children make moral judgments based on reasoning, according to many people who study children, whereas according to many people who study adults do not largely form moral judgments based on reasoning. So that the implication would be somehow that the ability to reason would be lost along the way from childhood to adolescence or to adulthood, which I don't know what do you think about the American political situation. It just is a very strange developmental picture to have of morality. So what I will try to do today is to put together, try to put these findings from with infants, with kids, with adults together and derive some insights about what I think we can learn from this literature and how it fits together, how the data fit together if we abandon some of the theoretical presuppositions. I'll be focusing on research on children's and adults orientations around force, so acts of force. Not because that's the only thing morality is about, not because it's the most important, but because it's something that's salient throughout the lifespan, from infancy up through adulthood. Acts of force is something that we encounter from the first year of life until our last. And it is easy to forget how close we are to acts of force and to violence in our society today. We do, those of us who live in relatively peaceful societies are well protected, and it's easy to forget. But we are actually surrounded by either actual or potential acts of force. We can think of the prison system. We can think about wars that go around us in Ukraine right now, for instance, but in many other places as well. We can think about contact sports, American football, rugby, soccer, places where people are using force in quite extreme forms sometimes in ways that are socially sanctioned. So acts of force is something we have to grapple with and something that society has to regulate, that morality has to regulate for us to get along and to function as a society. When I started studying infants in graduate school, something I became very interested in was infants' acts of force. This is a clip that you may have seen. It's commonly known as Charlie Bit My Finger. So it's a clip of one infant here biting his brother's finger. This is not a clip that I've obtained, obviously, but I didn't want, since we're broadcasting this, I didn't want to use one of our own research participants, so I'll just show you this because it's also famous. So, there. So what you saw here was something that we saw when we were doing these home observations with infants in their second year of life, where most infants during a 2-hour period over the course of the second year of life 3 times would at some point or another engage in what we call unprovoked acts of force. Hitting, biting, kicking a caregiver, a peer, for no apparent reason and without any signs of distress or frustration. So just they might go up to somebody and just hit them in the head with a bottle and smile about it. And although this kid initially, the sibling here initially smiled and laughed, eventually it got quite painful. And when we looked at how parents were reacting, they often were responding quite sternly, as we call it. For instance, using vocalizations such as these. I don't know if you can hear that, but that's what we call a firm, stern tone of voice. So parents saying, no, don't do that, which is very different from vocal tones we saw in response to other kinds of transgressions like making a mess, for instance. So this drew our attention to the fact that most infants were using force at quite high rates, higher rates than actually than in any later point in their lifetime, and on average. And B, that caregivers, siblings, other people around them were responding quite harshly to these things, that they mattered, that they cared about them. And obviously, they would care more about these kinds of acts if they were committed by older children and adults, because if everybody was going around hitting and biting each other for no apparent reason when they felt like it, our society would not look like the one we would like to live in and the one we recognize today. So fortunately for human society, virtually all human children go through a remarkable transition, unparalleled in the animal realm, where they start thinking that it's generally wrong to use force against others. And that they think is wrong, not just for somebody to use force against them, which is absolutely frustrating for anybody, no matter our moral capacities, but that it's wrong for them to use force against others, and it's wrong for 2 other people to hit each other, even if they have no investment in that situation. But not only do they think it's generally wrong to hit others, they also develop quite nuanced ideas about when it's okay to use force against others. This is obviously an American example of American football, people tackling each other quite forcefully. Most people in our studies, and generally we can tell, this is something that people not only think is okay, but a lot of people celebrate and enjoy watching. So people draw distinctions between acts of force that are okay and some that are not only okay, but actually fun. And perhaps because we have this kind of situational variability in views about force, we also come to disagree about when it's okay to use force. Some people think it's okay to use force to try to overturn an election that they perceive as illegitimate. Other people think it's okay for the Capitol Police here on the January 6th riots in Washington in 2001 to try to use force to stop these people from overturning the election. Right, so here is a case where we have a disagreement or whether it's okay to use force that comes from this possibility that we have of saying that it's okay to use force in some contexts, like self-defense, but not in others. So this is the orientation that we need to understand. How is it that kids come to think it's wrong to harm others in general, but then come to disagree about when it's okay to use force in many situations? And this capacity has 2 key characteristics. A, it is categorical, meaning that it's not just that I prefer that people not hit each other, it's that I think it's wrong to hit each other, that there's something categorically different about hitting versus not hitting. Hitting is wrong generally, not hitting is okay, generally. But it's also an agent neutral kind of evaluation, not just a preference for what I might do or what somebody might do to me, but that I think it's wrong for one person to hit another, for them to hit me, and for 2 people to hit each other. So these 2 characteristics is really what sets human morality apart from kinds of preferences that we can see among other animals, categorical and agent neutral evaluations. Among all the kinds of concerns with right and wrong that we can have, moral is only a subset. And I'm using moral here in quotation marks because I think of what I'm going to say now as a technical definition of morality. I don't pretend that this is the only way we should think about morality. This is just how I define morality. We can talk more about that if you'd like. But by moral, I mean right and wrong concerns have to do with other people's welfare, justice, rights, and within justice, I think of fairness as well. And these are further divided into, for instance, concerns with not hitting, or the concern with helping others, that it's good to help others generally, unless they're stealing something, for instance. And then among these concerns with not hitting, we also have principles that when it is okay to hit others, for instance, during contact sports with consent or in self-defense. And these kinds of considerations about right and wrong that I call moral are different from prudential considerations, which have to do with protecting one's own welfare, so eating healthfully, not walking too close to the edge of a cliff, and conventional, which have to do with regulating social interactions in ways that have an arbitrary component. For instance, wearing red sports jerseys or blue sports jerseys, or black gowns, blue gowns. Those kinds of considerations that are about things that authorities, traditions, or consensus dictate. And we can talk more about this if you'd like, but this is just the technical definitions I'll be relying on here without pretending that moral are more important. This is just what I mean by moral. Okay. So why do we come to disagree? Why do we come to form these different moral ideas about right and wrong ways of treating others when it's okay to hit others versus not okay to hit others? Why do we generally think it's okay? Why do we generally think it's wrong to hit others, yet disagree about when it's okay in many cases? One common view of this is what we might call nativism intuitionism, which combines an idea that we have certain innate emotional moral intuitions, say that it's wrong to harm others, that explain why we generally agree that force is wrong. And then to that, supposedly, is added socialization, which then refines these intuitions and leads us to disagree. So that some cultures it's okay to hit children when they misbehave, and others it's not. So this, of course, you will recognize the classic kind of dichotomy between nature and nurture, between genes and environment. This is the same kind of thinking here, and I'll love to discuss that more too. And I don't mean to, and I'm not going to provide an argument for why we shouldn't think like that. I'm only saying that if we think about morality this way, and only this way, we leave very little room for agency, the fact that individuals can challenge the existing norms in their society. We leave little room for reasoning, if it's all about these kinds of affective intuitions that are just jumping out automatically, and then we afterwards concoct reasons. And the innate, learned distinction also is not very compatible, I would argue, with developmental biology, with understanding of how genes are translated into proteins, which then shape how organisms develop. And we can talk more about this, but I'm just highlighting this is kind of one common view of thinking about moral development and why we agree and disagree. And it's a view that differs from the view I'll be taking today. The way we like to formulate our questions without assuming this dichotomy between innate emotional intuitions and then socialization of those intuitions is to ask, rather, how is it that humans develop so as to reason, judge, feel, and insist that acts of force are wrong in most situations, yet right in some other situations? Okay, so this is a way of asking a question about development without presuming that we can separate the components that are innate from those that are learned. And to answer this question, which is a quest that we and other people are engaged in, we have to integrate across different literatures. We have to integrate across the literature around moral nativism. Here, Paul Bloom saying, you can see glimmers of moral thought, moral judgment, and moral feeling even in the first year of life. Some sense of good and evil seems to be bred in the bone. We have to integrate across the literature we can call moral development, which deals with children and adolescents mostly, which here represented by Elliot Turiel says things like, moral decisions involve reasoning about moral goals, welfare, justice, and rights, and non-moral goals, including social coordination. And we have to integrate across the what we kind of call the moral psychology literature, which mostly deals with adults, which can say things like, this is John Haidt speaking, moral reasoning is something we engage in after an automatic process has already pointed us towards a judgment. So here, going back to the Martian I alluded to earlier, if the Martian took these three codes and tried to make sense of human reality, it would be as if infants were making moral judgments without reasoning because they're too young to reason. Then kids came in and they started making judgments based on reasoning. And then adults came around and they somehow then lost the ability to reason, but still made moral judgments, again, based on these kinds of automatic emotional intuitions. So these are the literatures we're trying to put together, seeing what we can learn from the empirical findings while trying to surmount some of the dichotomies and theoretical tensions that we see in the theoretical accounts of morality over the past 20 years. So to give one label to this, we can call it a developmental moral psychology, this trying to piece these things together. And by developmental here, I mean a approach that focuses on construction, the active role of individuals, trying to make sense of their world, kids trying to understand what goes around them, trying to challenge some things that parents say and agree with others, and interaction, learning through interacting with other people, not being socialized, but actively engaging, transgressing, getting feedback, deciding based on that feedback what to do next. So, from that those large literatures, there's a lot one could say, but I'm going to focus on 3 insights corresponding to infancy, childhood, and adulthood, or later development, including adulthood. And I'll start with the infant roots. So where do these moral ideas about force come from? Obviously, somehow they must develop out of something that happens in infancy, and that's where we started to in our research. So we started looking at kids' everyday experiences with force. So this is one study we did where we observed 26 infants over the course of the second year of life at 14, 19, and 24 months. And we wanted to see what kinds of acts of force were they engaging in, how often, and specifically we were interested in the distinction between unprovoked acts of force, so occurring without provocation, without anybody taking anything from them beforehand, and provoked acts of force, which were happening in response to provocations. For instance, it's like a sibling taking a toy and then the infant just smacking the sibling to get the toy back. And the reason why we're so interested in this is that it's very easy to explain. If we think that infants have some kind of moral capability, it would be very easy to explain away infants' higher rates of acts of force if all they were doing were hitting in self-defense or in frustration. Because then we could just say, well, infants, they just can't regulate their anger. They don't know what to do because they get frustrated, so they just lash out at somebody. It is harder to understand why infants would be engaging in unprovoked acts of force where there's no anger to regulate. The presence of unprovoked acts of force would suggest that there's something different that infants see in acts of force, that they don't have this strong aversion to using force when they feel like it as a form of social exploration. And our data suggests that especially in the first half of the second year of life, unprovoked acts of force are quite common. They become more common, even though infants are getting the feedback that they shouldn't be doing this. They're actually becoming more common before it then seems to increase, at least in this study. Whereas provoked acts of force are becoming increasingly common over the second year of life, and overall rates of force tend to peak around the third year. So this is just describing to us that most infants hit others, bite others, kick others at rates that would be unrecognizable at later ages, and that about half of those in the second year of life are unprovoked and happening without provocation. So that sets up a kind of context where infants can learn, okay, what is it? How are other people reacting to these kinds of acts? How are other people feeling about being hit, bit, kicked? To examine this, we looked at a couple of different dimensions. One of them was these vocal reactions that I alluded to earlier, where we had we did some naturalistic work too, where we looked at what kinds of vocalizations are happening in real life in the homes. But we also wanted to do this experimentally, so we showed mothers of 14-month-olds these 12 naturalistic clips taken from the homes. Some showed acts of force, so a kid hitting somebody. Some showed child safety events, so a kid climbing towards the edge of a couch, for instance. And then some showed disorder events, so a kid spilling food, say, or pulling all the shoes out of the shoe rack. What we were interested in here was specifically the vocal tones that parents would use when they were instructed to tell a child in this video clip not to do what they were doing. So the parents would be watching a video clip of a kid hitting somebody, and then we'd ask them to say, if this is something you would prohibit your own kid from doing, then prohibit that using the words, no, don't do that. So we could standardize the verbal content. And we identified these 4 vocal tones. One we called angry or firm stern. One we called fearful. One we called warm. And one we called playful. That was hard to hear, but no, don't do that. So this kind of laughing tone is what we identified as playful, which we saw at some rates among these mothers using these kind of playful tones. Even the kids were doing something wrong, they were sort of laughing about it. As we had predicted, These angry tones of voice were far more common in response to acts of force than in response to child safety events, and quite rare in response to these kids spilling food. The fearful tones of voice were more common for the child safety events, and the warm and playful tones of voice were more common for the disorder events. So just by the vocal tones, not disregarding the content, the verbal content, which is hard to process for young infants anyways, the vocal tones here are giving the kids a sense that there's something distinct about acts of force that makes it differently wrong and perhaps more severely wrong than other kinds of violations. And we also saw these kinds of patterns of different kinds of reactions across multiple dimensions of caregiver behavior. So we saw more anger, also more self-reported anger, more physical interventions when kids were hitting somebody, more direct commands like "do not do that," as opposed to "let's not hit." We didn't get that as much. So like these indirect commands, or "do we want to hit?" Like there was more of this like "no, do not do that." Whereas for other kinds of so safety violations or mess violations, we saw more of the warrant, playfulness, more distraction, like "oh, look over here," or more kind of a relenting compromising. So we almost never saw parents saying, "Okay, you can hit your brother a little bit." We did see them say, "Okay, you can play with my cell phone a little bit, and then we'll put it away." So all these things are pointing in the same direction. There's something distinct, something important about not hitting others. Of course, at the same time, infants are also getting support for what they should be doing or what caregivers want them to be doing. So we've seen that a lot of infants, all infants we observed in the homes were engaging in helping, so handing things to caregivers, participating in cleanup, and even turning on the dishwasher. And this, of course, is something that Robert has studied too. We were particularly interested in hearing the role of encouragement and praise. We saw here that a lot of most of the situations were receiving kind of positive, either encouragement, praise, or some combination thereof, indicating that this is something caregivers wanted kids to do more of. Often, by the way, in response to kids' interest in the activities, the kids would like come over, like, "oh, what's going on here?" Or like look towards the caregiver, and then the caregiver would say, "Oh, do you want to help? Do you want to do this? Do you want to put this away?" So there's an interaction here. It's not just like caregivers forcing pro-sociality onto their kids, but it's the kids being interested in being part of what they're also doing and then being invited in and supported. And of course, the question is, well, are kids using all this input, or is it just like going over their heads and they just keep on doing whatever they wanted to do anyways? Well, we have experimental and correlational evidence indicating that kids are using these data. And here, experiments are crucial, right, to assess causality. So we do see that kids are helping more after they receive encouragement and praise for helping, especially early on when they're learning a new helping activity. Later on, late in the second year of life, these simple helping tasks, when they're just picking up out of reach objects, encouragement and praise doesn't seem to have an effect because they already sort of mastered the skill. So the effects of encouragement and praise on simple helping is most obvious around the first birthday or early in the second year. We also see that they showed greater compliance with these angry tones of voice that they were associated with the acts of force. So they're also using signals from emotional tones from the parents to guide their behavior. Okay, so this is just some evidence that kids they're engaging in helping and harming, which pertains to the welfare of others, and they're getting signals about how those are affecting other people. But does this amount to morality? Or are these kids able to make moral distinctions? Some people have claimed this. So this is a headline from The Atlantic, the magazine that was published in the US. As babies, we knew morality, and implying somehow we lost it along the way. And these claims are based on a series of amazing, studies by Connolly Hamlin and others now at UBC, University of British Columbia, where kids would see this morality, they call it morality plays, where two puppets were engaging with this neutral puppet. One puppet was always helpful, another puppet was always mean, and then the kids would get a choice. The infants would get a choice between the nice puppet and the mean puppet. And at about chance levels, kids as early as 5 months would reach towards or pick the nice puppet, and at 3 months they would look more towards the nice puppet than the mean puppet. So based on these kinds of findings, it's been claimed that these kids in the first year of life even are making moral judgments. So it of course depends on what we mean by morality, what we would label these tendencies, but they do not meet the criteria that I set out for moral judgments. So if you want to define morality some other way, we could talk about that, but I nonetheless would argue that there's something important about what these kids are not doing, right? That there's something more to be done in morality than simply preferring helpful over hindering puppets. And I don't at all diminish the importance of the work. I just don't think that it quite meets this criterion of morality as I define it. Because what we want to see was categorical distinctions. So this is good, this is bad. Whereas what the preference paradigm is showing is simply a preference for the helpful character. And secondly, we wanted to see agent neutral evaluations. Of course, these are third-party evaluations in the sense that preferences, or the third-party preferences, they are preferences for puppets that infants have observed. But there's no evidence that infants are applying their evaluation to their own acts of force, which we know that they're engaging in. We don't see infants showing signs of guilt really until the third year of life at the earliest in a reliable fashion. Certainly not in the first year of life. So on both of these criteria, I would argue, the infant's social preferences for helpful characters don't quite meet the agent neutral and categorical evaluations based on concerns for others' welfare that we need to see for it to be morality in the sense that we're talking about here. So my first lesson and I'll be faster with the other two, is that through social interactions in the first year of life, first 2 years of life, infants become more helpful and more harmful. But they don't yet make moral judgments, right? So that's important. That's the beginning, the kind of building block, the roots of morality, but not yet morality itself as we've defined it. So when do we see evidence that kids are actually meeting these criteria or making agent neutral and categorical judgments based on concerns with others' rights and welfare? Well, to answer that, we need to ask, okay, what are we looking for here? What exactly does it look like to make those kinds of evaluations? What does it mean? What kind of evidence do we need to see to conclude that infants have moral concerns in the sense defined here? Do we want to look for judgments, reasoning, emotions, or actions? Or do we want to look for all four? Here I would say we really want to look for all four. If children were showing one of these but not the others, there would be something amiss. If humans were showing one of these but not the others, there would be something amiss with their moral capabilities. If they said that something was wrong but showed no emotional reactions when somebody hurt somebody else, there would be something that still had to be developed. So that's why we want to look at all four and see when are we seeing that these are coming together, showing that infants are generally concerned with the wrongness of harming others. And by reasoning here, I mean the ability to articulate, point to features that make it wrong to harm somebody else, and that those features are actually guiding infants' judgments. So, for instance, being able to say that hitting is wrong because it hurts somebody else, and then say that it's okay to hit somebody if the person actually isn't hurt, say for instance. And I'll say more about that. There are many studies that look for these four indicators of moral concerns. I'll just show one study that we did fairly recently with Antonio Langenhoff and Mahesh Srinivasan at Berkeley. And I mention this because this is one of the few studies that looked at acts of force or acts that were causing pain in somebody else, and seeing how how preschoolers were reacting to that. So here we're looking at 3 to 5 year olds. We show kids an interaction where one puppet is pressing on the body of another puppet, and then the victim puppet says, ow. And there's also a teacher that says, no, don't do that. And we have another condition with a conventional violation, and there's a lot more to the study, but I'll just focus here on the fact that kids were seeing this interaction where one kid was pressing on another, one puppet pressing on another puppet, and the puppet receiving the press said, ow. And then we asked, was it okay? Why not? And would they try to intervene to stop this from happening? And also, would they do it themselves? Would they like to press this puppet in this particular way? And here we're seeing, okay, our infants, or sorry, I keep saying infants, so you're speaking of infants, our kids constructing a moral evaluation of this novel act that seems to pertain to the victim's welfare. And here we're seeing that 87% of the kids said that the act was wrong. So yeah, they were about articulating judgments. Among these, when we asked them, okay, why is it wrong? The vast majority, nearly all of them, referenced the victim's welfare. So like, it hurts. And then we also saw that 32% intervene, which is about the rate that we see in intervention studies with these young children. We don't rarely see that all the kids intervene in every trial. And lastly, it also guided their actions in another way, that 81% of the kids refused to copy the act, to do this thing, oppressing the victim in this way that it caused pain. Whereas kids were much more willing to press on a button that made a sound, even though that had also been prohibited by a teacher in the other condition here. So across judgments, reasons, and actions here, we see evidence that kids are having a moral concern with other people's welfare that leads them to negatively evaluate acts that harm others and to avoid doing them and try to stop them from happening. And of course, there's a whole wealth of studies that are pointing to the emergence of moral concerns by 3 to 4 years of age. Evidence for judgments, for reasoning, for emotional reactions, and for actions such as interventions or resource distributions, all pointing in the same direction of kids having genuine agent-neutral categorical moral concerns based on other people's welfare, rights, justice around the 3rd birthday, and certainly by the 4th. So, second insight here, by age 3 or so, most humans develop moral concerns with others' rights, welfare, and justice that are reflected in judgments, reasons, actions, and emotions. But preschoolers, 3 to 5-year-olds, are not yet adults. It's an obvious statement, but what does it mean? Well, it means, for example, that these kids are not making the kinds of discriminations between acts of force that are okay versus not okay that adults are doing. So just to give you one example of that, we did a study where we wanted to know if kids were drawing distinctions between times when it was okay to use force and others when it was not. So would they think it's okay to use force in a rough and tumble play, which you know kids do a lot in preschool? Or would it be okay to use in self-defense, or would it be okay to use during a property conflict? Here we saw the 3 to 5-year-olds, they were making a statistically significant distinction between these contexts. So they were more likely to say it'd be okay to use force in property conflicts and during rough and tumble play than compared to the unprovoked context of just walking up to somebody and pushing them. So that's good. Okay, so by the statistical significance criterion, they did make these distinctions on average, but these distinctions that the kids were making really pale in comparison to the distinctions that the adults were making, our adult sample was making for the same stimuli. Right? So the adults were making a really sharp distinction between the situations of property conflict and unprovoked acts versus self-defense and play, where they were much more likely to say, okay, use force. So a lot is happening beyond the mere emergence of these moral concerns we see around age 3. So this is what I will call adult branches, to stick with the tree metaphor for another couple of minutes. And here in this last part, I'll just ask for some examples of how do disagreements about force develop from these shared moral concerns. We see that shared moral concerns evident around 3 in most kids, but yet we all come to disagree about when it's okay to use force and not. And why is that? I'm going to give you two kinds of sources of reason variability, meaning variability that's not just based on situational features manipulating us into thinking that something is okay in one situation, not another, or not. I'm not going to talk about incidental affects, for instance, like disgust. I'm going to give you 2 ways in which reasoning about situations will lead to variability when it's okay to use force and when it's not. The first source is what we call descriptive beliefs, or sometimes called informational assumptions. So these are non-evaluative beliefs about the psychological, social, or physical world that underlie our judgments about right and wrong. So one example is climate change. So if you think that humans burning fossil fuels is causing a warming climate, which in turn affects human welfare, for instance, by creating droughts or wildfires, then that's going to incline you to negatively evaluate the burning of fossil fuels. If you don't have this causal belief, then you have no reason to have anything against the fossil fuels, right? So it's a non-evaluative belief. It's just a causal idea that burning fossil fuels is causing global warming that's affecting human welfare that is guiding a judgment of right and wrong. So bringing this into the realm of force, we did a study, this is unpublished work with my grad student, Charles Baxley. We did a study where we wanted to see, okay, how come everybody is sitting around watching these professional people using force against each other, and sometimes in very intense ways, and enjoying it and improving it if they generally think it's wrong to use force? It must be that, at least under some circumstances, people think it's okay to use force. So we showed them football, basketball, rugby, football meaning American football, sorry. I'm European, so I'm on your side, but please my employers. And we show them clips within each sport that were either clearly permitted acts, like a legal screen in basketball or a legal tackle, ambiguous, where it was a forceful play that was like happening in play, but that was in violation of the sport's rules, and then clearly prohibited, meaning acts of force that were happening outside of play. The whistle blowing plays over, and then some player just punches another. We asked them, not just like, we asked them also, like, is this act permitted in the sport? But now I'm going to focus on the question of, should it be permitted, right? So do they actually want people to be able to do this in the sports, right? This is their own opinion. You think this should be okay in the sport? And how harmful was the act? And here is the role of the descriptive beliefs, right? So we want to know, are beliefs about harmfulness of these kinds of force acts in sports predictive of, or possibly guiding judgments about which acts could be permitted and not? So are they more likely to think it'd be okay to do this kind of act if it's not that harmful? So here on the graph here, you'll see harmfulness acts, judgments on the x-axis. So further to the right means more harmful according to the participant. And then here you see the rate of people saying the act should be permitted in the sport. So we're expecting here a negative relation between harmfulness, perceived harmfulness, and permissibility. And as we across all these four sports, and across the three contexts, we see the same pattern, that the more harmful an act was perceived to be, the more likely people would be to say, this should not be permitted in the sport. So it's not very harmful, it's okay when we do it, people should be able to do it, it's fun to watch. It's very harmful, like causing concussions, all kinds of things, then it shouldn't be part of the sport. So this is one example of how different perceptions of what's harmful and not causes disagreements of what should and shouldn't be permitted in the sports. And you can see this in the debate about concussions in football as well, and well, both kinds of football probably. Second source, and I know I'm approaching my end time here, this talk was designed for the American colloquium slot, which is more like 45 to 50 minutes in here. I'm trying to like squeeze it into the British format. So should be almost good. So second reason source of variability, why people disagree, based not on emotional states per se, but rather considerations about the situation, reasoning about different principles, is what we call coordination of concerns, meaning that people are balancing, in many situations, competing considerations. They have multiple principles that they believe in, that they endorse, they embrace. Okay. Okay, all right. All right. Well, for those who are just joining us, this trolley situation is one trolley situation is there is a person standing on the footbridge and you're standing on the footbridge next to that person. There's a train coming down the track on its path to killing 5 people on the track. The only way you can save these is to put the other person, who is fairly large and sometimes is carrying a large backpack, onto the railroad track. That will stop the train. The person is large enough to stop the train and thereby saving the 5 people on the track, but the one person will die, the person pushed from the footbridge. So in other words, it's the person on the footbridge life versus the 5 people on the train track. And in our particular variant, these 5 people were described as railway workers. So this is a situation where the life of one person and the right of that person to stay alive is pitted against the lives of these 5 people. So this is the kind of conflict between considerations that I mentioned. So we did this study with high schoolers, undergrads, and adults. Is it okay to push one person, save 5 workers? Only 16% said okay. That's about what other people have found. But importantly, this is not some kind of automatic decision that people making easily. 71% spontaneously expressed conflict. Well, I'm not quite sure, but it doesn't quite seem right to do so. So they're balancing these considerations. They're conflicted about it. Most of them come down on the side of saying it's not okay to push the person. But then we want to know, okay, why is that? Which considerations are they giving priority here? And are those considerations really guiding their judgments? One we were particularly interested in was what we call victim involvement. So about 42% of the participants said, well, it's not okay to push this person because this person has no involvement in the situation. They didn't put themselves in a situation of danger. They were standing there and suddenly they're thrust into this life-threatening or life-taking situation. That's not fair. That's not right. You don't have the right to put somebody in a situation of danger like that. So we thought, okay, one possibility is this is just some post-hoc rationalization. They don't actually care about this. They just concocted that when we asked them. Another possibility is this is actually a principle that they were balancing here, that they were concerned with. Well, how do we tell those 2 possibilities apart? Well, one way of doing that, or the way to doing that, I'd say, is to manipulate the situation and see if we change the victim involvement, do the judgments change accordingly? If participants are right about their reasons, then it should. So we had a situation where a culprit was standing on the footbridge. We didn't call him that, but we said, this is the person who set off the train to try to kill these 5 people. Now, would you want to push that person to stop the train? In this case, the victim is no longer innocent. And we had another sample just saying that, asking that question too. And 73% said, well, in that case, it would be okay. I mean, they might still have been conflicted about it, but they still said, okay, that would be okay. So that's, of course, significantly different from the percentage that said it'd be okay to push in the standard scenario. So here we see people make a judgment. They say they make it based on a principle of victim involvement, which changed the feature of the situation that principle they're referring to, and their judgments change accordingly. So to summarize here, with our 3 insights were through social interactions in the first 2 years, infants become more helpful and more harmful, but they don't make moral judgments yet. By age 3, they do show moral concerns for others' rights, welfare, and justice. But beyond that, of course, there's a lot happening. And I pointed to 2 sources of variability in judgments about forceful acts. Both descriptive beliefs about what is or isn't the case, how the world works, and also how people coordinate competing considerations. Right? So they recognize the situation pertains to multiple principles and in conflict, and they try to balance those and sometimes come out on different sides. So those were my 3 insights from developmental moral psychology. I want to thank you all for coming here and for listening to me. And sorry, I went a little bit over time. And I also want to acknowledge my collaborators and sponsors and students and everybody else who's made this work possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really greatly appreciate it. We have time for questions. And can I encourage especially early career colleagues to go ahead and ask your questions? The floor is open.
And could you look for questions online?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I think in your framework, you sort of said moral judgments are both it's categorical and it's agent free almost. Why would you? I'm curious as to why you think it's categorical when it makes sense that some actions are worse than others. Probably explain some of the conflict that we were expressing. So can this be captured better if it was more of a how bad is the action as opposed to a yes and no? Change things. Sorry, that wasn't.
Oh no, yes, absolutely. So yeah, I should have been clear about that. So I guess what I when I put it that way, talking about the categorical nature of moral judgments, I'm saying that that ability has to be present for us to say that morality is present. But once you have that ability, you can also make relative discriminations between some acts being worse than others. But if you also didn't have the ability to say that this act was wrong and this act was okay, and there's a categorical difference between that, if you didn't have that ability, then we wouldn't say that you had acquired a moral capability in the sense we're talking about here. So yeah, I'm not saying that there aren't any graded moral judgments. No, so I completely agree with you. Thank you for asking that and giving me the opportunity to clarify. Yes.
Something that caught my eye was in the finding about how when you compare children and adults and how wrong would they say that using violence in specific situations was, that children tended to say that it was not okay in self-defense, and it was even under some of the other situations that might be like a little murkier in my view. And I was wondering if you just have any hypotheses on why that might be, that they're not like perceiving this like self-defense as a valid excuse to use violence.
Yeah, I don't know. We wondered about that too. Obviously, we had predicted that they would show similar rates of not saying that's not okay to, or saying that it is okay to what we saw in the property conflict and the play situation. I'm hesitant to make too much of it because we had a Turkish sample of preschoolers and they actually they showed the other pattern where they said that the self-defense was more okay than the property conflict. But it is possible that some of it had to do with the way we presented it to them. It's possible also that children in the preschool we studied were used to teachers coming in to defend them if they were under attack, but maybe not so if there were just a property conflict. But I think it's a crucial question. My suspicion is that if we had something we would like to do, don't steal this paranoid place, is to interview kids about naturalistic videos, so showing the videos of things happening. I suspect that we might see that they would be approving if they saw clearly what was happening. It could have been something about our description too. Because part of the challenge was that when we set up these situations, because we wanted to keep the force acts and nature of the act the same, we had for it to be plausible that the force act could happen both in an unprovoked situation and in the play context. It had to be sort of intermediary severity. Like you can't make it plausible that some kid just like as part of rough and tumble play goes over and like punches another kid with like a 2x4 and they like in the face. Like that just like that's not obviously not rough and tumble play. So we had to like go for the intermediate range of severity, so that could have been part of it too. So that because the intensity of the force, something we're looking at now in naturalistic videos, clearly something that's going to matter as well, not just the context.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, so just to kind of play off of that, could it also just be that from a child's perspective, they are just never allowed to use violence as proposed by their immediate sources of control, because even what they would consider self-defense would be, I don't want my mom to brush my teeth because it's an annoying thing. And the mom says, no, you're not supposed to. So they're really never allowed to use this in that sense. Is that maybe also why they would just say like, it's just never okay, because everyone's been telling me that when I do it, it's never okay, regardless of the reason?
It is possible. As far as we can see, preschool teachers aren't intervening anecdotally. Preschool teachers aren't intervening so much on when they're doing a rough and tumble play. So there are contexts where they can use force. So it is possible that they simply are don't think it's okay to use in self-defense or not much in property conflict either, genuinely. So even if they do think that it is okay in rough and tumble play. But I want to see more studies, because this is really the first study of this sort. Certainly the first to include rough and tumble play as one of the contexts where they use where they evaluated force. So I want to, before I accept that, I'd want to see a little more. We do know that kids are using a lot of force in these at this age. So even though they're not using it as much and probably not as indiscriminately as an infancy, they're still hitting more in the preschool years than they are later on. So we wanted to, that's why we wanted to see, are they using these acts of force in ways that align with their judgments, or are they really using force when they think that they really shouldn't be? And so we're still exploring that.
So what if the model is an adult? Would that make a difference?
Was that
If the model, like the story that's based on we're an adult, because maybe they would be okay with their parents using it sometimes, whereas they would think that they were not.
Oh, if somebody's attacking their parents, and then that'd be interesting. Yeah, because now we interviewed adults about kids kids protagonists, and to flip it would be interesting. I think also we're going to see huge contextual or cultural variability here. So we know certainly by like 8 years and older, kids who grow up in communities with a lot of violence, where violence is just a part of what you encounter, are similarly condemning of unprovoked acts of force. So they don't think it's okay to hit somebody for no reason, but they are more accepting than the typical white middle-class kid in a more calm neighborhood, more accepting of using force in self-defense or even to defend your honor. And we even see there's some work with looking at parents too, saying they actually encourage, not unprovoked force, but actually encourage hitting back in some communities. They see it as a necessary part of getting by. So I think that's also another dimension that will be important to look at here.
Online question, right?
For a short one. Victoria Hawks asks, were there any gender differences in the population of children studied?
In the what? The gender differences?
Gender differences in the population of children you studied. Yeah.
Not huge ones, systematic ones that I can recall. I mean, there are like occasional studies that had like one effect and then didn't show up in another study. We know, of course, that as kids get older, boys tend to use more force. So I expect that we'll see in the naturalistic study we're looking at use of force in the preschools, that boys are using more force. But in the preschool age. But that those differences, and also with regard to empathy, there's some evidence that female girls are showing more empathic reactions later on. But those distinctions aren't as clear in the earliest years that we've looked mostly at. But surely they are going to be some. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
I
Beg your pardon?
Oh, you need to run, right?
So let's do one more question, of course. Great.
So let me get this. The talk focused on moral judgments using moral concepts, moral rightness and moral wrongness. Infants and children in early childhood might not verbalize those moral concepts, but the experiments you presented are meant to show an understanding of them. What about judgments using so-called thick moral concepts like kindness, selfish, courageous, etc.? When would an understanding of those concepts begin? How would the argument presented today relate to the use of thick moral concepts? That was more than.
Oh, great. Yeah. So this idea of thick moral concepts, which I'm no expert on, people may be familiar with, but the idea is that certain ways of labeling an action as kind, for instance, is both a description of like what the act is doing, like something for the welfare of somebody else, and in consideration of somebody else's welfare, but it's also conveying an evaluation that there's something good about what that person is doing, as opposed to a word like okay, which could be applied to virtually any action. I think that kids in the preschool age are able to use words like that. In fact, when we ask them for evaluations, we often get these kinds of evaluative terms, like why is it okay to help, or why should Peter help his mother like clean up his room when we've studied kids' prosocial actions, helpful actions, they often say, well, because it's a nice thing to do, or it's kind, or things like that. And we've asked, in some other studies, we asked them we give them different kinds of violations. We asked them like, well, is this silly or is it mean? And we see that kids are much more likely to say that an act was mean if it was a hitting action, and much more likely to say it was silly if it was irrational, like if somebody hitting like a nail with a sponge or something like that. So it does seem like kids 3, 4, 5 years of age, at least in English, and I would expect anywhere, use those kinds of thick ethical concepts as well. So I think that's an interesting direction to go in. Further, we've done a little more work with that with adults, where we looked at how they were systematically using different kinds of evaluative adjectives or thick ethical concepts really for different kinds of conventional violations. So it was more like a cleanliness kind of convention, they would call it gross. Like if somebody was one of the things that people came up with was like walking around barefoot when it was raining in Santa Cruz. People thought that was gross. So, okay. We generated this from the students themselves. But they wouldn't call that like rude or something. They would call it gross. But I think that's very interesting. And I think we, as we're using these interview methods, could do a lot more to think more about how we're wording our questions and how we're either forcing or allowing people to use these kinds of thicker concepts as well as the okay, not okay that we often rely on. So thank you.
Great. I would say before we thank all, I just wanted to